Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. I hope that you are all well. This is where I talk about the books that I'm reading. I like to read diverse books and I highlight Canadian literature. If you are new, thanks so much for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. I am still getting caught up with my best books of 2023. And today I am going to be talking about my top 10 nonfiction books that I read in 2023. I already shared my top 15 fiction books of 2023. So if you haven't seen that yet, I will leave a link to that video below so that you can check it out. From the 105 books that I read last year, 22% of them were nonfiction, which isn't too bad for me, since I do tend to read more fiction. Also a reminder that these are the top nonfiction books that I read in 2023 and not necessarily published in 2023. In fact, I don't think any of these were published last year. So these are all backlisted books. These are my top 10 nonfiction that I think are worth recommending. Again, I will share them in order of most enjoyed to least enjoyed, but all of these received 4.5 or higher rating. So this could look different on any other day. I won't be going into great detail on these because I have already talked about all of them either in my wrap-ups or other videos. So here we go. Just realized I forgot my number 10 over here. At number 10, it is a Canadian book. This is Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. This is a nature book and a memoir. My favorite thing about it was probably how Suzanne Simard wove those two things together. Her work as a forest ecologist and her own personal life story. So if you enjoy nature writing, if you love trees, then I think that this book is worth checking out. The book at number 9 is The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. This book makes the list because of the story, not necessarily because of the writing. This story has a lot of elements that I love. It's a story of survival and redemption with an extraordinary friendship as well. Anthony Ray Hinton spent close to 30 years in prison. He was wrongfully convicted of murder, and this is the story of how he survived his time on death row and how he fought for his freedom. The Skin We're In by Desmond is at number 8, another Canadian. This takes a look at 1 year, 2017, in Canada and what issues arise about racism and injustices against Black lives. And I liked the structure of this book. Each chapter covers 1 month, and this book sheds a light on things that are just not talked about, I think, enough in Canada. At number 7 is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. This is a fantastic book. In fact, I talked about this book, The Sun Does Shine, and 2 other books in a video called A Nun, a Lawyer, and 2 Books on Death Row. I will link it below if these are the kind of stories that you are interested in. I find the work that Bryan Stevenson does so inspiring. He works for justice. He's the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and he helps get people who are wrongfully convicted off of death row in the US. So I learned a lot about death row and the justice system in the US as well because of this book. Next on the list at number 6 is a memoir and a love story. It's From Scratch by Tembi Locke. This is also a film which I watched after reading the book. Tembi's husband Sabo dies, and we know this from the beginning of the book, so it's not a spoiler. This story is about how they met and their determination to not let anything get in the way of their love for each other. That means even disapproval from family, and I think that this book shared their love story in a very beautiful way. It's a sad story, but it's also endearing, and I like how it deals with grief as well. This brings us to the top 5 nonfiction books that I read in 2023. At number 5 is Permanent Astonishment by Tomson Highway. Another Canadian to make the list, and a Canadian that I think flies under the radar. I've said before that I think Tomson Highway is one of the most underrated Canadian icons. Tomson is two-spirit. He comes from a very large family in northern Manitoba. He's a residential school survivor, and he's a super, super talented musician and artist. After reading this book, I would add an exceptional storyteller to the list. Tomson Highway begins with his birth. He talks about life in the North and what it was like before first contact. Tomson shares his experience in residential schools, but he doesn't dwell on it. The story only goes into his teenage years, so I am hoping that he will write more about how he got into the arts. And I do have a few more of his books on my shelf, and I really want to read them. At number 4 is a heartbreaking story, and another one that is also a film. Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand is another story of redemption and survival. This is about Louis Zamperini, who was an Olympic runner before World War II, and he was an airman in the war, and he is taken as a POW when his plane is shot down. His time in the camps was very difficult. There are many scenes that are hard to read, especially how Louis was treated by one of the officers in particular. And this is also a story about PTSD. It's about conversion and forgiveness. It's an incredible story for sure, and I highly recommend it. Number 3 is another Indigenous Canadian writer, and it's Call Me Indian by Fred Sasakamoose. Another heartbreaking story that is beautifully told. Fred Sasakamoose also begins his story with his ancestors and what life was like for them before first contact. He shares stories of his family and how he and his siblings were forcibly removed. They were taken to residential school. And Fred talks a bit more in detail than Tomson Highway about his experience at the residential school. For Fred, he loved hockey, and it became an escape for him. He talks about making it to the NHL and the racism that he experienced. This book is written with real honesty. Fred shows his vulnerability by talking about his failures as well as his successes, and he also talks about his trauma and how it affected him and his family. And I think that I've probably said this before, but this is in my top Indigenous memoirs. And that leaves my last 2 books, which could be interchangeable, really. I went back and forth with which one I was going to put at number 1 and which one at number 2. So for number 2, at least today, it is The Only Plane in the Sky by Garrett M. Graff. I spent most of the month of September reading and listening to this book. I do love New York, and I love books set in New York, and this year I was so glad to finally read this. And I say that I listened to because I had heard a number of different people talk about how good the audio was for this, and it definitely adds to the story because you hear the different voices and hear the emotions. There is even some of the recordings of the phone calls from the planes. I also think that listening to it was important because it is an oral history of 9/11, and the audio has a cast of more than 45 people, and it takes you through the entire day from before the planes hit the towers to the end of the day. And it is not an easy read, especially since I found myself, I relived so much of the day over and over. And there were some very moving parts, and there were a few times where I just had to close the book, which also has pictures. And I'd close the book, turn the audio off, and not read it again for a day or two. And I also learned about a number of things that hadn't really been on my radar before, like how they use the Hudson River to evacuate people. And I loved that the stories came from all kinds of different people, everyday people to celebrities, even someone from space who was the only one to experience things from that vantage point and that perspective. There are frontline workers, survivors, and family members of people who died that day. And I just thought that this was so well done. There was so much research and gathering of information and material and resources to put this all together. So it took me a little while, but I'm so glad that I finally read this book. So that means that my number one book of 2023 is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I buddy read this book with Gemma from Gem of Books, and if you have already watched my top fiction books of 2023, then you know that we had a fiction book make it into my top fiction books list as well that we had buddy read. And Gemma and I haven't always liked the books that we've read together, but I really enjoy reading with Gemma, and we both got a lot out of this book, I think. This is the story of how Chanel Miller takes back her identity after she was sexually assaulted by Brock Turner. And this story had a high profile, so for protection and anonymity, Chanel was referred to as Emily Doe during the trial. And this book goes through what happened, and then it goes through the trial and the impact that it had on Chanel. Two reasons, basically, this book made it to number one for me is because of the impact it had and continues to have on society. Secondly, I was genuinely impressed by Chanel Miller's writing and how she was able to articulate her own growth and understanding over time. She uses her experience to shed light on how victims are treated and the various other flaws in the system. I also think that Chanel sharing her impact statement and using her voice has reached far beyond what I think she even imagined. In several of my other books, this book or this story, this case was mentioned. So I was able to see the influence that Chanel Miller is having in large part because she shared her story in this book. So many of my top nonfiction books have difficult topics, intense topics, but I think that all 10 of them are important stories and they have all made an impact in their own ways. Please let me know if you have read any of these nonfiction books, or if any of them interest you. What nonfiction books did you enjoy the most in 2023? I would love to hear all about it. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.